The sun rose slow and amber over the mobile delta, the light spreading across the water like spilled honey. The cypress trees stood silent, their roots gripping the muddy banks as mist curled between them. Henry Lowell steadied his small aluminum boat, the hum of the old Johnson motor blending with the soft rustle of morning. To most people in Mobile County, this was just another day. But for Henry, it felt like one of those mornings meant for quiet thinking, a man, a rod, and the still breath of nature before the world woke up. Henry was 62, retired from the Alabama shipyard after nearly 4 decades of steel and sweat. He'd earned his rest. Folks said he was steady as the tide, never one to complain, always ready to lend a hand or fix a motor that wouldn't start. Martha, his wife, had kissed him goodbye at dawn, half asleep but smiling. "Don't forget your hat," she'd murmured. He'd waved from the doorway, fishing pole in hand. The Mobile River had always been his refuge. The week before, he'd told his neighbor, "Sometimes I think the river knows me better than people do." That was Henry, plain-spoken, humble, and full of quiet wisdom that only hard years can teach. Before we dive into this mystery, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories that uncover hidden truths. By 9:30 that morning, the sun had burned off the fog. The only sign of Henry was his parked truck at the old boat ramp off Dead Lake Road. The driver's door hung slightly open. Inside, his keys were still in the ignition, a thermos of coffee sat half empty, and the radio whispered a country song that had long ended on static. The air smelled of brackish water and diesel. When Martha hadn't heard from him by afternoon, she called their son Danny in Pensacola. "He never stays out past lunch," she said, her voice trembling. Danny thought maybe the boat motor had quit, or his father had decided to fish longer. But by sunset, when the mosquitoes started thickening and the light drained from the sky, the call went out to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Dale Murdoch arrived with his deputies, boots crunching on gravel. He was a large man with a slow drawl and sharp eyes that missed little. "Boat's gone," he said, scanning the water, but no sign of a struggle. Martha stood by her husband's truck, gripping the doorframe as if it could steady her heart. "He wouldn't just leave," she whispered. "He never would." Searchers launched boats with floodlights that cut silver lines across the dark river. They combed the reeds and mudflats, calling Henry's name into the night. Frogs answered. Nothing else. By morning, the river carried only the hum of insects and the creak of empty docks. In town, whispers began before the coffee cooled at Roy's diner. "Maybe he fell overboard," someone said. "Or maybe he met somebody down there." A few nodded, remembering that Henry had argued with an old co-worker the week before, something about money or pride, but most refused to believe it. "Not Henry," they said. "He was solid." Days passed. The sheriff's office found the boat adrift near Little River Cutoff. The fishing pole snapped in half, the tackle scattered. No footprints on the bank, no body. Just the slow pulse of the tide, swallowing answers whole. When Martha sat alone that night, she heard the echo of the river outside their window. In her heart, something deep and cold began to settle. The water had taken him, she thought, or someone had. Either way, the world had shifted and nothing would ever be the same again. By sunrise the next morning, the small fishing pier at Dead Lake Road had become a gathering place for worry. Trucks lined the gravel lot, headlights cutting through the early fog. Men from town stood with coffee thermoses in hand, their faces drawn and quiet. Sheriff Dale Murdoch stepped out of his cruiser, rubbing his jaw as he surveyed the water. "We'll start upriver," he said to his deputy, his tone steady but grave. Martha Lowell sat in the passenger seat of her son Danny's truck, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "He's out there somewhere," she said, her eyes fixed on the moving current. Danny, a man who'd inherited his father's quiet strength, nodded, though his voice faltered. "We'll find him, Mama. He probably drifted farther than we think." But his words hung thin, swallowed by the sound of engines firing up and boats sliding into the murky water. Sheriff Murdoch coordinated volunteers, local fishermen, a few off-duty firefighters, and even some teenagers who'd grown up hearing Henry's laughter echo from this same pier. They swept the banks with poles, searched among the reeds and fallen logs, calling Henry's name again and again. The river gave nothing back, By noon, the sun beat down hard, and the air felt thick enough to chew. One of the volunteers, a wiry man named Pete Johnson, came back shaking his head. "It's like he vanished into thin air," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. The sheriff glanced at the river. "Ain't no such thing," he replied. "The river keeps what it takes, but it always gives something back eventually." Back on shore, Martha waited, her mind looping through every possibility. Maybe the motor quit, and Henry tried to push the boat. Maybe he slipped. Maybe... She stopped herself. The word maybe had begun to feel like a punishment. A deputy approached gently, offering her a bottle of water. "Ma'am, we'll search until dark," he said. She nodded, though she hadn't heard half of it. Her thoughts were drifting downriver, following the current that had swallowed her husband's silence. Inside the sheriff's truck, Murdoch studied the file spread across the seat. A man like Henry Lowell didn't just disappear. He'd been on that river more times than anyone in the county. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no tracks, just an empty boat. It didn't sit right. "We'll drag the channel again tomorrow," he muttered, half to himself. "Maybe something'll turn up when the tide changes." As the afternoon waned, tension began to rise among the volunteers. Rumors were spreading fast. A teenager claimed he saw another boat near Henry's that morning, but couldn't recall the color or the face of the person aboard. An old-timer swore Henry had been worried lately, talking about unfinished business. Sheriff Murdoch listened, but said nothing. He knew how talk could twist truth in a place this small. When dusk settled, lanterns flickered along the dock. The air smelled of fuel, sweat, and swamp grass. Danny stood beside his mother, his voice barely above a whisper. "If he's gone, we'll bring him home anyway," he said. Martha turned to him, tears carving lines down her cheeks. "He's not gone," she said. "Not until I say he is." The sheriff called off the search for the night, promising to start again at dawn. As the boats returned one by one, their engines coughing softly in the dark, the only sound left was the slow lap of the river against the wood. The same river Henry had loved his whole life now held him in silence. And deep down, everyone knew. They were no longer searching for a lost fisherman. They were searching for a truth that didn't want to be found. By the third day, the search had slowed, but the talk had not. In Mobile, rumors traveled faster than river water. At Roy's Diner, where the biscuits were still baked from scratch and the coffee never truly fresh, folks leaned over their plates and whispered Henry Lowell's name like a prayer or a warning. "I heard they found the boat near Little River Cutoff," said Mrs. Clark, stirring sugar into her mug. "Empty. Not a sign of him." "Maybe gators got him," replied her husband, shrugging. "That river's meaner than it looks." But the younger men, the ones who'd worked the docks with Henry, had other ideas. "You forget Earl Simmons?" one asked, voice low. "They had words last week at the shipyard bar." Heard Henry told him off in front of half the crew. A silence followed. Earl was well known, a wiry man with eyes sharp as nails, the kind who remembered every slight. Nobody said much more after that, just let the words hang like the humidity that never left the air. Sheriff Murdoch knew the talk would grow wild if he didn't steady it. He stopped by the diner that afternoon, nodded to the regulars and said, "If anyone's got something real to say, my office door's open, but I don't deal in ghosts or gossip." His tone made clear he meant it. Still, as he walked out, he could feel their eyes following him. Back at the station, the phones rang off and on. People certain they'd seen Henry near the causeway, others swearing they'd heard a boat engine in the night. Each call led nowhere. Deputy Carter, a young man new to the force, looked up from his desk and said quietly, "Sheriff, maybe it really was an accident." Murdoch rubbed the back of his neck. "Maybe. But men like Henry don't just vanish. Not without someone seeing something." That night, Martha sat in her living room, curtains drawn tight. The house smelled of cedar polish and Henry's old cologne, faint but still there. Danny had gone home to his own family, promising to come back at dawn. She tried to rest, but couldn't stop hearing the creak of the porch swing outside, the same rhythm her husband had loved. A knock came around 9. It was Pastor Lee from First Baptist, hat in hand. "Martha," he said gently, "folks are praying. You're not alone in this." "I know," she answered softly, but prayers don't tell me where he is." Her words cut the quiet, and the pastor simply nodded, leaving her with a jar of stew from one of the church ladies. She didn't touch it. The thought of eating felt like betrayal. Meanwhile, Earl Simmons kept mostly to himself. He lived down a dirt road outside Bay Minette, where the pine trees grew thick and the crickets never stopped. When Sheriff Murdoch paid him a visit, Earl leaned against his porch railing, chewing tobacco and staring straight ahead. "You and Henry talked last week?" the sheriff asked. "Yeah," Earl said. "About fishing, same as always. Anyone see you together?" "Don't reckon they did. Wasn't long, man, just like to talk." There was no flicker of guilt in his voice, no tremor of nerves. But when Murdoch turned to leave, Earl added, "He was a good man. Ain't right what's happening. You should look down river near the marsh." "Sometimes things wash up there." The sheriff paused, noting the direction of Earl's eyes, east toward the darker bend of the river. "We will," he said. Back in town, as darkness crept across the rooftops, the whispers grew again. Folks said Henry must have known something, that maybe someone wanted him gone. Nobody knew for sure, but one truth was clear. Mobile was changing. Their place that once felt safe now carried a quiet edge of fear, and the longer Henry stayed missing, the deeper that fear took root. 2 weeks had passed since Henry Lowell's boat was found adrift, and the Mobile River carried on as if nothing had changed. The tide still rose and fell, the fishermen still cast their lines, but the silence hanging over the water felt heavier now. Like a secret, it refused to surrender. One humid afternoon, Sheriff Murdoch stood on the muddy bank south of the cutoff, staring at the slow swirl of current where driftwood gathered. Deputies had found something caught among the reeds, a faded tackle box, its metal hinges rusted and stiff. Inside were Henry's initials scratched in his familiar hand, and beneath the lures and hooks, a torn piece of plaid fabric. Martha recognized it instantly. "That's from his fishing shirt," she said, her voice trembling. "He wore it that morning." The sheriff studied her face before answering. "Could have ripped on a branch," he said quietly, but his eyes told a different story. He knew too well how easily the river could wash away truth, piece by piece. The find renewed the search for a few more days. Volunteers combed the marshlands again, boats dragging slow lines through murky water. The air buzzed with insects and heat, the smell of salt and decay clinging to every breath. Nothing else surfaced. No footprints, no equipment, no trace of Henry. Just the endless rippling of brown water against the banks. That night, back in her living room, Martha spread the torn fabric on the table. She traced the frayed edges with her fingertips, as though the threads could tell her what happened. Danny watched from across the room. "Mama," he said softly, "you can't keep torturing yourself like this." She looked up at him, eyes rimmed red. "You don't understand. If the river took him, I'd feel it. I'd know." Danny hesitated, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "Maybe it's not for us to know," he whispered. She shook her head. "No, Danny, somebody knows. Somebody always knows." At the station, Sheriff Murdoch went over his notes again. The currents were strong that season, unpredictable. A man could be pulled under and never surface. His body carried miles before settling. Still, something in his gut resisted that explanation. He circled the same lines in his notebook over and over. Keys in ignition, no drag marks, no blood. It didn't fit an accident. He called Deputy Carter over. "That tackle box was found 15 miles downstream, right?" "Yes, sir." "Then how come there's no sign of the boat's motor scraping the mud? If he fell in, it'd drift in circles, but it didn't. It went straight." Carter frowned. "Could someone have pushed it off after?" Murdoch didn't answer. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen. The sound echoed like a clock ticking down to a truth he wasn't ready to face. By Sunday, the town had grown restless. At the diner, the whispers returned. Talk of foul play, talk of debts, talk of men settling old scores. But no one dared speak too loudly. The sheriff kept his ear to the ground, pretending not to listen. Late that evening, he drove out alone to the pier where Henry's truck had been found. The wood planks creaked under his boots as he looked out across the dark river. A single light from a houseboat flickered in the distance. The water below reflected nothing, just blackness, deep and still. He took off his hat and let the wind brush through his thinning hair. "All right, old friend," he murmured. "If you've got something to tell me, now's the time." The river, as always, gave no reply, only the slow rhythmic lapping against the posts, as if mocking him with its patience. Somewhere in that silence, Murdoch felt the uneasy certainty settle in his chest. Henry Lowell hadn't been claimed by the river. He'd been erased by something far colder. By late summer, the search for Henry Lowell had ended. The sheriff's office issued a short statement. No further evidence found, presumed drowned. It was meant to close the case, but for the people of Mobile, it only sealed an emptiness that refused to fade. The flyers with Henry's photograph curled at the edges in the heat, the ink bleeding from humidity. His name slowly slipped from headlines to footnotes, from conversation to silence. Martha Lowell lived in that silence. The nights stretched long in the small house at the edge of town, the rooms too still, the air too heavy. Henry's fishing rod stood by the door like a ghost waiting to be carried again. She refused to pack away his things. "He's coming home," she'd say whenever someone suggested otherwise. Danny stopped arguing after a while. He came by every weekend, mowed the lawn, and fixed what needed fixing, but he couldn't reach the part of her that had frozen the day Henry vanished. Neighbors tried to help. Pastor Lee visited with warm meals and Mrs. Clark brought fresh bread from the diner. Martha thanked them politely, always with the same faraway look. One afternoon, when Pastor Lee urged her to consider a memorial service, she stared out the window at the slow drift of clouds and said quietly, "You don't hold a funeral for someone who isn't gone." Meanwhile, Sheriff Murdoch filed the final report. The papers felt heavier than they should have, as if the ink itself carried guilt. He read it over twice before signing. Cause of disappearance, accidental drowning. The words left a sour taste in his mouth. He leaned back in his chair and muttered, "If it was an accident, why can't I believe it?" But no one was left to ask. Cases got closed, lives moved on, and the river, unchanged, kept rolling toward the Gulf. Months became years. The world outside shifted, but inside the Lowell house, time stood still. Christmas lights went unstrung. Birthdays passed without candles. Martha still set 2 cups on the table each morning, pouring coffee into one and letting it cool untouched. Some called it denial, others called it devotion. Either way, it became her rhythm, the waiting, the remembering, the quiet conversations with a man she refused to bury in her mind. It wasn't until the early 2000s that anyone new asked about Henry. A young woman named Lydia Kane, a college student from Mobile, stopped by one afternoon with a notebook in hand. She was researching local mysteries for her journalism class and had heard about the fisherman who vanished. Martha opened the door halfway, unsure. "Mrs. Lowell?" Lydia asked gently. "I'm sorry to bother you, ma'am. I'm writing about your husband's story. People still remember him." Martha studied her a moment before stepping aside. "Not enough people do," she said. "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table, sunlight slanting through the lace curtains. Lydia asked careful questions: what kind of man Henry was, what he loved, what that morning had been like. Martha answered softly, sometimes smiling, sometimes pausing so long that Lydia thought she might stop entirely. When the young woman stood to leave, she said, "Thank you, Mrs. Lowell." "I know this isn't easy." Martha looked up, her voice steady but fragile. "Easy left my life a long time ago, dear, but if you're going to write about him, tell it right. Tell them he was more than a mystery. He was a good man." Lydia promised she would, and though she left thinking it was just a college assignment, something in Martha's words stayed with her. Outside, the air smelled faintly of rain and pine. Somewhere downriver, the water kept whispering the same name it had swallowed years before. By 2017, Mobile had changed almost beyond recognition. New stores lined Government Street, old shipyard warehouses had been turned into offices, and the once quiet riverfront now buzzed with life. Yet for those who'd lived long enough to remember, there were still places where the past clung like mist, unchanged, unresolved. One of those places was the file room at the Mobile Register, where Lydia Kane stood one late afternoon, thumbing through a dusty folder labeled Lowell Henry, 1995. She had started as an intern 10 years earlier. chasing community stories about festivals and fishing tournaments. Now, as a full-time reporter, Lydia had built a reputation for persistence. But something about Henry's file called to her. Maybe it was the handwritten note on the cover, "Case closed, insufficient evidence." Or maybe it was the memory of Martha Lowell's eyes that day, full of grief that refused to age. Her editor, a grey-haired man named Richard Hale, spotted her at the back table. "You chasing ghosts now?" he asked, smiling faintly. "Maybe," she said, flipping open the file, "but this one feels unfinished." He shook his head. "You'll find most of them are." Inside the folder were a few yellowing police reports, a single grainy photo of Henry's empty boat, and a handwritten list of items recovered. A thermos, a cooler, keys, one torn shirt. But what caught Lydia's attention were two missing evidence numbers. "There's supposed to be more," she murmured. Richard leaned over. "If it's a cold case, most of that's long gone. Floods, storage moves, bureaucratic rot, you name it." Still, something itched at the back of her mind. She took the file to her desk and started digging through old newspaper archives. The story had faded from print after just a few weeks. "Retired worker presumed drowned," one headline read. Another mentioned rumors of a dispute at the shipyard but offered no details. Lydia scribbled notes, her coffee cooling beside her. That evening, she drove out toward the Delta, the same way she had years earlier when she was just a student with too much curiosity. The road to Dead Lake hadn't changed much. Narrow, cracked, hemmed in by pine and swamp grass. She parked near the old boat ramp, now overgrown with vines, and sat for a while, listening to cicadas hum. The air was thick with memory. She whispered to herself, "Where did you go, Mr. Lowell?" Back in town, Lydia stopped by the county records office, where an elderly clerk remembered the case. "Oh, that was before my time," the woman said, "but my daddy used to fish out there. Said that river don't keep nothing buried forever." The words stuck with Lydia as she left, scribbling them in her notebook. It wasn't much, but it was something, a thread to pull. When she returned home, she called her old college advisor, Professor Harold Nance, who had guided her early work on unsolved stories. "You're still chasing the Lowell case?" he asked, half laughing. "I never really stopped thinking about it," Lydia said. "There are holes in the report, missing files, evidence that vanished. It doesn't feel right." Nance's tone softened. "Then chase it. But remember, small towns guard their ghosts. Sometimes the truth costs more than it's worth." Lydia stared at the old photograph pinned to her corkboard, the one of Henry standing on the pier, smiling faintly, fishing pole in hand. She'd found it years ago, framed in Martha's house. Now it felt like he was looking right at her, waiting. She whispered, "I'll find out what happened." "I promise." The street outside her window was quiet except for the low hum of distant traffic. Somewhere out there the mobile river still flowed, wide and unbothered, carrying secrets older than time. Lydia didn't know yet what she was stirring, but something deep beneath that calm surface was ready to rise. The next morning, Lydia sat at her desk surrounded by copies of old shipyard employee records. The fluorescent light hummed overhead as she traced her finger down a list of names. Near the bottom was one that stopped her, Earl Simmons. The same man who'd been mentioned in the original police notes as Henry's close co-worker. Something about the word close didn't sit right. She dug deeper, searching through archived interviews. In one short statement from 1995, Earl had told investigators that he and Henry talked fishing sometimes, but hadn't seen each other in weeks. Yet, a letter tucked between the old reports told another story. It was unsigned, written in uneven blue ink. "You and I both know what they did with the pension fund. If it comes out, they'll come after both of us. Be careful who you trust." Lydia leaned back, heart thudding. The letter had been found in Henry's garage, according to the notation. She looked again at the handwriting. It wasn't Henry's. That evening, she drove across the bay toward Bay Minette, where Earl still lived. The sun was dipping low, staining the sky orange over the pine trees. His house was small, set far off the road, the yard cluttered with tools and fishing gear. She parked and stepped out, notebook in hand. Earl answered the door after a long pause. He was older now, grey stubble covering his chin, his shoulders stooped. "You a reporter?" he asked. his voice a rough drawl. "Yes, sir." "Lydia Kane." "I'm writing about Henry Lowell." At the mention of the name, Earl's expression tightened. "Ain't nothing new to write," he muttered. "Maybe not," Lydia said, keeping her tone calm. "But I found a letter. Looked like someone was scared of something at the shipyard back then. You worked there too, didn't you?" Earl's eyes flicked past her toward the empty road. "People always scared of something," he said after a long silence. "Doesn't mean it mattered." "But it mattered to Henry," she pressed. "He went missing a week after that letter was written." He turned back toward the door, hand on the knob. "You should leave the dead where they are, miss." "I can't," Lydia said softly. His wife waited her whole life for answers. She deserves the truth. For a moment something cracked in Earl's face, an emotion buried too long to name. He exhaled hard. "You ever work a shipyard?" "No." "Then you don't know what men do to keep food on the table, or what happens when they talk too much." He stepped onto the porch, the boards groaning beneath his boots. Henry was stubborn. Thought honesty would fix everything, but it don't. Sometimes it just gets you hurt. "Are you saying someone hurt him?" Lydia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Earl's eyes lifted to hers, dark and wet. "I'm saying he wasn't the only one who knew about that money mess. Some of us kept quiet. He didn't." He looked out toward the trees. "And I still hear that river some nights. It never stops talking." She waited for him to say more, but he turned away, retreating into the house. The door clicked shut behind him. Back in her car, Lydia sat for a long moment, the engine off. The air was thick with the scent of pine and old oil. Her notebook lay open on the passenger seat. The words she'd written barely legible in the fading light. Pension fund. Henry knew. Earl scared. Cover-up. As she started the car, her headlights swept across a rusted tackle box leaning against Earl's porch, its paint chipped, faint letters still visible. HL. Lydia froze, her breath caught in her throat. That couldn't be coincidence. She whispered into the quiet night, "What did you do, Earl?" The road back to Mobile felt longer than ever, the dark woods pressing close on either side. For the first time, she understood what Sheriff Murdoch must have felt years ago, the sense that the river hadn't taken Henry Lowell at all. People had. Lydia barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faint letters HL on that tackle box outside Earl's porch. By morning, the unease had hardened into determination. She drove straight to the courthouse in downtown Mobile, her recorder in her bag, and Henry Lowell's file under her arm. The building's marble halls smelled of old paper and humidity, the kind of air that held secrets. She approached the records clerk's window, flashing her press badge. "I'm looking for pension and payroll documents from the Alabama shipyard, fiscal years 94 and 95, she said. The clerk, a balding man with a polite but tired expression, frowned. "That's a tall order. Most of that stuff was archived off-site after the merger. Some went missing in a flood about 15 years ago. Is there anything left?" He sighed. "A few ledgers, maybe. But you'll need clearance. I'll wait." 2 hours later, Lydia was led to a dim back room where cardboard boxes were stacked in uneven towers. She pulled on gloves and began digging. Receipts, attendance sheets, pension drafts, most irrelevant. Then, in a folder marked confidential, she found it. A ledger showing unexplained withdrawals totaling nearly $50,000 from the shipyard's employee fund. The signatory line read, "Earl Simmons, foreman." Her pulse kicked up. Henry must have discovered it. The missing money, the argument, the letter, it all pointed to a cover-up. She took photos of the pages, her hands trembling. As she packed up, a voice startled her. "You shouldn't be in here." It was a man in a dark maintenance uniform. He wasn't a clerk. "I'm with the register," Lydia said carefully, "just looking at old shipyard records." His gaze lingered on the file under her arm. "That case is dead for a reason," he said, voice low. "Leave it that way." Before she could answer, he turned and walked off, his boots echoing down the corridor. Lydia's breath came shallow. Something about the way he said it, flat, practiced, felt rehearsed. She hurried out of the building, her stomach tight with dread. That evening, she sat in her apartment replaying the encounter in her mind. Who was that man? How did he know what she was looking for? When she checked the courthouse directory, there was no maintenance employee listed under his name. He didn't exist on paper. She called her editor, Richard Hale. "I found something big," she said. "There were withdrawals from the pension fund, tens of thousands. Earl Simmons signed off on them." There was a pause on the line. "Lydia, listen," he said, his tone cautious. "If you're right, that's serious, but digging into 30-year-old corruption tied to local businesses, you could make enemies. Be careful what you print." "I'm not backing off," she said. "Henry Lowell deserves to be more than a footnote." After she hung up, Lydia pulled up the old police report again. One detail she hadn't noticed before now burned in her mind. Evidence log signed off by Deputy J. Harlan, missing samples, mud tire tracks. Why had the samples vanished? Who had signed them out? The phone rang suddenly, jarring her. She answered on instinct. A man's voice whispered, distorted and hoarse, "Stop digging, Miss Kane, you're stirring things better left under." The line went dead. Her hand trembled as she set the phone down. The city outside her window seemed quieter than usual, the street lamps casting long shadows. Somewhere beyond them, the mobile river flowed like it always had, indifferent and ancient. Lydia pressed her palms to her face, heart racing. Fear clawed at her, but beneath it was something stronger, a fierce sense of duty. Whatever she'd uncovered wasn't just about money. It was about power, silence, and the cost of truth. She opened her notebook and wrote one sentence across the top of a clean page. "If they're warning me, it's because I'm close." And she was right. The deeper she went, the more the water began to stir. The morning after the threatening call, Lydia sat in her car outside Magnolia Oaks nursing home, her fingers gripping the steering wheel. She had come to see Martha Lowell for the first time in years. The last time they'd spoken, Martha's hair had been white, but her eyes still sharp. Now, according to the nurse on the phone, she was frail, spending most days lost somewhere between memory and silence. Still, Lydia needed her. The answers were fading, and Martha might be the last person who remembered the truth clearly. Inside, the hall smelled faintly of disinfectant and lavender. A television murmured in the background as Lydia followed a nurse down the corridor. When they reached room 112, the door was half open. Martha sat by the window, a blanket draped over her knees, the light catching the silver in her hair. She turned slowly when Lydia spoke. "Mrs. Lowell." "It's Lydia." "Lydia Kane." A flicker of recognition passed through the older woman's eyes. "The reporter," she whispered. Her voice was softer, but it carried that same quiet resolve. "You came back." "Yes, ma'am, I've been looking into Henry's case again." Martha nodded faintly. "You still believe there's more to find?" "I do." Lydia pulled a chair close. "I found proof there was money missing from the shipyard. Henry might have known." "Did he ever say anything about that?" Martha's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the cup of tea beside her. "He said things were wrong at work," she murmured. "Said some men were taking what didn't belong to them. I told him to stay out of it. He wouldn't listen." "What happened the morning he disappeared?" Lydia asked gently. The older woman's gaze drifted to the window, where sunlight spilled across the sill. "He got a phone call before he left," she said slowly. "Early, just after dawn. I was making coffee. He picked up the receiver and didn't say much, just listened. When he hung up, he looked different. Quiet, but sure. I asked who it was. He said it was someone from the yard. Then he kissed me and walked out." Lydia's pulse quickened. "Do you remember the voice? Anything about what he said?" Martha frowned, closing her eyes. "Only one thing. He said, 'If I don't go now, they'll come here.'" The room went still. Lydia felt a chill run through her chest. "Did you tell the police?" "I did," Martha said softly. "But they said it didn't mean much. Just worry talk, they called it. After a while, nobody wanted to hear about it anymore." Lydia hesitated, then reached into her bag and placed a small recorder on the table. "Mrs. Lowell, I think Henry found something that put him in danger. There are people who don't want this story told." Martha's eyes sharpened for the first time. Then you be careful, child. Men like that don't forgive. Henry thought truth made people brave, but he was wrong. It just makes them targets. Lydia swallowed, emotion tightening her throat. I'll be careful. I promise. Martha smiled faintly. He used to write things down, you know. Notes about the men he didn't trust. Said paper remembers when people don't. After he disappeared, I found his old fishing log in the attic. I kept it. Do you still have it? Lydia asked. The older woman nodded weakly toward the small dresser beside her bed. The nurse helped retrieve a weathered leather notebook, its corners frayed from years of handling. Lydia opened it carefully, each page filled with Henry's tidy handwriting, fishing dates mixed with coded lines and initials. Martha's voice was a whisper now. He said if anything ever happened, the truth would be in there somewhere. Lydia pressed her hand over the worn cover, her heart pounding. She realized that Martha had been keeping this piece of Henry safe all along, waiting for someone who still believed. Outside, the wind rustled through the oaks, a low whispering sound that carried both grief and promise. As Lydia left the nursing home, the notebook clutched against her chest. She understood. Henry Lowell hadn't just left clues about corruption, he'd left a map to the truth. Lydia spent the night hunched over Henry Lowell's fishing log, every page smelling faintly of river water and old tobacco. The handwriting was neat but coded, dates and initials scattered between lists of fishing spots. It took hours before she noticed a pattern. The initials matched shipyard supervisors and foremen, each followed by short notes and numbers that weren't fishing depths. They looked like dollar amounts. Near the back of the book, one entry stood out. ES Met 412 said they'd fix the books before audit. Won't sit quiet much longer. ES. Earl Simmons. Lydia felt the air leave her lungs. Henry had been documenting the fraud. He'd known the pension fund was being drained and had written proof of it. The next morning, Lydia called a man she'd interviewed once before, Tommy Hensley, a retired accountant who had worked for the shipyard during the mid-90s. He answered on the second ring, his voice gravelly but alert. Tommy, it's Lydia Kane. You remember me? Sure do. You wrote that piece about the Port Authority. Why are you calling about a dead fisherman? Because he wasn't just a fisherman. He was onto something big. Embezzlement in the pension fund. I need your eyes on a few records. There was a long pause. Meet me at Cooper's Cafe in an hour, he said finally. At the cafe, the smell of fried shrimp and coffee filled the air. Tommy arrived wearing a faded ball cap, a folder tucked under his arm. Lydia showed him the ledger entries, pointing out the initials and numbers. He adjusted his glasses, reading slowly. Lord, he muttered, these figures, they line up. There was a payout listed in 95 that never made sense, 50,000 gone before the merger. We were told it was a clerical error. He flipped through his own folder, pulling out an old payroll sheet. See that? Same names, same pattern. Lydia leaned forward. So Henry found this out. He must have confronted someone. Tommy nodded grimly, and got himself silenced for it. Her stomach knotted. Why didn't anyone ever catch this? Because the people running the audit were in on it, Tommy said. One of them went on to be a big man in the Chamber of Commerce. Nobody wanted that mess dragged out into daylight. They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the diner around them. Lydia's mind spun. If the fraud tied back to powerful figures still in Mobile, exposing them could destroy careers, or worse. Tommy lowered his voice. You need to be careful, Miss Kane. Men who steal money ain't half as dangerous as men who steal peace. They'll protect their legacy before they protect the truth. Lydia looked out the window at the grey water of the bay beyond. I didn't come this far to stop, she said. When she returned to her office, she began compiling everything, the ledger pages, Tommy's records, and the old police notes. As she organized the evidence, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. We warned you. Stop before you end up like him. Her throat went dry. She locked the doors, drawing the blinds. Her hands trembled as she picked up the notebook again. There was one last page she hadn't noticed before, tucked beneath the back cover. In Henry's neat script it read, If something happens to me, They'll find the proof where the work began. The docks never forget. Lydia stared at the words, a shiver running through her. The docks, where Henry had spent his life, where the river met the steel bones of the shipyard. Whatever proof he'd left behind, it was still there, waiting. She closed the notebook, her decision already made. Tomorrow, she'd go to the docks. If the river had swallowed Henry's truth, she was ready to pull it back from the deep. The next morning broke grey and heavy, clouds pressing low over the mobile river. Lydia drove across the old causeway, her headlights cutting through the fog that clung to the marshes. In her passenger seat sat the worn fishing log, the last words of Henry Lowell echoing in her mind. They'll find the proof where the work began. She parked near the abandoned section of the Alabama shipyard, now fenced off and forgotten. Rust streaked the walls, and weeds pushed through cracked pavement. The smell of salt, oil, and metal hung in the air. She hesitated at the gate, then pushed it open enough to slip through. The wind carried faint echoes, the metallic clang of old memories, the creak of ships long dismantled. She met Tommy Hensley by the east loading dock, just as they'd agreed. He wore his old shipyard jacket, collar turned up against the cold. "You sure about this?" he asked, glancing around. "Henry said the proof's here," Lydia replied. "If he hid something, it has to be in the old storage units, the ones marked from the 90s. They started through the maze of corrugated metal buildings, their footsteps crunching on gravel. The dock's skeletal cranes loomed overhead, frozen in time. Tommy pointed toward a row of rusted lockers along the far wall. Those belonged to crew foremen back then. They used to keep ledgers, parts, personal stuff. Could be what he meant. Most of the lockers were empty or filled with scraps, but one at the end caught Lydia's eye. Faded white paint spelled out HL95. Her heart thudded. "Tommy," she whispered. "This is it." He handed her a small crowbar. "Let's see what your fisherman left behind." The metal groaned as the lock snapped. Inside, beneath a layer of dust and spiderwebs, sat a weathered tackle box and a folded sheet of metal wrapped in plastic. Lydia's hands shook as she lifted the box. The initials HL were still visible beneath the grime. She opened it carefully. Inside were several old film canisters, a notebook, and a faded photograph of Henry standing with a group of men at the dock, Earl Simmons among them. Tommy examined the metal sheet. "It's part of an old hull section," he said, brushing it off. "Looks like it's been here for decades." Then his brow furrowed. There was a reddish stain along one edge, old but unmistakable. Lydia swallowed hard. "Do you think—" Tommy nodded slowly. "Could be blood. Could be proof." Before she could respond, the sharp sound of footsteps echoed behind them. They froze. A flashlight beam cut through the shadows. "Who's there?" a voice barked. Lydia turned, her pulse spiking. A security guard stood at the far end of the dock, one hand resting near his belt. "This property's off limits," he said. "You need to leave." Tommy raised his hands. "We're just looking for records, historical research." The guard stepped closer, his light flashing across the tackle box. "That belong to you?" "No," Lydia said quickly. "It belonged to Henry Lowell. He worked here." The man's expression shifted slightly at the name. "You'd better go," he said, lowering his voice. "You're stirring things that don't need stirring." When they turned back to the locker, the tackle box was gone. The space where it had rested was empty, a faint outline of dust marking its absence. Lydia's heart dropped. "It was right here," she said, frantic. "It was right here." Tommy searched the ground, but the box had vanished as if swallowed whole. They left in silence, the fog closing behind them. As Lydia reached her car, she stared back at the dark outline of the shipyard. Somewhere inside those walls, the truth had slipped through her fingers again. But now she knew. Someone else was watching, and they'd been one step ahead the whole time. Lydia drove straight to Sheriff Dale Murdoch's house that night. The old man had retired years ago, but his name was still etched into the bones of Mobile County. His porch light glowed faintly through the moss-draped oaks as she parked in the gravel drive. The moment he opened the door, his eyes, cloudy but alert, narrowed in recognition. "Miss Kane," he said, leaning on his cane. "Didn't figure I'd see you again." "I need your help," Lydia said. "It's about Henry Lowell." At the mention of the name, something passed across Murdoch's face. Regret, maybe guilt. "Come on in," he said quietly. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and cedar. His walls were lined with photographs, old deputies, hunting trips, community awards. Lydia placed Henry's fishing log on the table between them. "I found this," she said, "and I found the locker he left behind. There was evidence, but someone took it before I could bring it in." The sheriff studied the notebook without touching it. "You stirred up something buried deep," he murmured. "You know, back then I knew that case didn't sit right. But when I pushed too hard, the county attorney told me to back off, said it was a waste of resources." "You think they covered it up?" Lydia asked. He met her gaze. "I think certain people made sure the river got blamed instead of a man." "Earl Simmons?" she pressed. "Earl was scared," Murdoch said. "He wasn't innocent, but he wasn't the one pulling the strings. There was someone higher up, someone with money tied to that pension fund. You know the name, don't you?" Lydia hesitated. "Richard Hale," she whispered. Murdoch nodded slowly. "Your editor." "He was part of the shipyard's board back in the 90s, Lydia said. Her stomach turned as the realization sank in. "He's been warning me off the story, telling me to drop it." "Then he's protecting himself," the sheriff said. "Henry must have confronted him before he disappeared. Maybe Hale made sure it never reached the papers." Lydia felt anger burn through her shock. "He's been feeding me lies this whole time." The old man leaned forward, his voice low. "If you want justice, you'll need proof that ties him directly. The tackle box, the ledger. Without them, all you've got is rumor." "I'll find it," she said. He nodded slowly. "Be smart about it. Men like Hale don't use fists. They use silence. And they've had 20 years to build walls thicker than the truth." As Lydia stood to leave, he said softly, "Henry was a good man. He came to see me the day before he vanished. Said he was meeting someone at the docks who promised to set things straight. I should have stopped him." She turned at the door. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Murdoch looked down, his hands gripping the cane. "Because they'd already decided what happened. A retired fisherman drowned, neat and easy. I didn't have the stomach to fight the tide." Lydia stepped out into the night air, the weight of his words settling like humidity on her skin. The sky above Mobile was low and restless, the sound of thunder rolling in from the Gulf. She got into her car, gripping the steering wheel tight. If Hale had been part of the corruption, and if he'd silenced Henry to protect his reputation, then he was the last barrier between truth and justice. Lydia knew confronting him could cost her everything, maybe even her life. But for the first time since she'd opened that dusty file, she didn't feel afraid. She whispered to herself, "He's not the river. He can't bury it forever." Lightning flashed across the bay, illuminating the skyline. Somewhere inside that light, Lydia felt Henry's presence, quiet, urging her forward. Tomorrow, she would face the man behind the curtain, and this time, she wouldn't come empty-handed. Rain pounded against the newsroom windows the next morning, blurring the view of downtown Mobile. Lydia sat at her desk, staring at Richard Hale's office door. She could hear him inside on a call, his voice calm, composed, too composed. Every instinct in her screamed that the man she had trusted for years had been part of the cover-up that took Henry Lowell's life. She opened her laptop and began compiling the evidence she had. The ledger photographs, Tommy's verification, Martha's testimony, and the coded notes from Henry's fishing log. It wasn't enough for a full exposé, but it was close. Still, one piece was missing, the physical proof from the dock locker. Without it, her story would die in legal red tape. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number again. She froze before answering. "Miss Kane," a voice rasped. "You're looking for the tackle box." Her pulse jumped. "Who is this?" "I can't say, but it's been turned over. Check the evidence room at the county sheriff's office. Tell them Deputy Sanders sent you." The line went dead. Within an hour, Lydia stood in the sheriff's office, rain dripping from her coat. A young deputy behind the counter looked up as she showed her credentials. "I need to see an item recently logged, related to the Henry Lowell case. Deputy Sanders approved it. The deputy frowned. Sanders? Ma'am, there's no one here by that name. Lydia's stomach twisted. He called me, said the box was logged here. He hesitated, then disappeared into the back. Minutes later, he returned carrying a sealed evidence bag. Inside it, she saw the weathered tackle box, a tag marked, "Recovered, Mobile Shipyard." Her breath caught. "Can I look at it?" "Under supervision only," he said, unlocking a small interview room. She sat down as he placed the bag before her. Her fingers trembled while unsealing it. Inside, along with the old lures, were 3 items: a blood-stained rag, a bent pocket knife, and a small plastic vial with dried residue on the rim. The label read, "Sample 47, Truck Seat." Lydia stared. Where did this come from? The deputy glanced at the paperwork. This was checked out in 1995 by a Deputy J. Harlan and never returned. Someone must have refiled it recently. Her heart pounded. The name, Harlan, was in the missing evidence log she'd read. The vial could contain DNA from Henry's truck, possibly connecting someone to the disappearance. She called Sheriff Murdoch immediately. "I've got something," she told him. "Blood from Henry's truck. If we test it, maybe we can match it to someone." "Bring it to the lab," Murdoch said. "I'll make a few calls." Quietly. 2 weeks later, Lydia sat in the sheriff's office again, her hands clasped tightly as Murdoch laid out the results. "It's a match," he said. "The blood in that truck seat belongs to Henry Lowell. But here's what's worse. There's another DNA profile mixed in." She leaned forward. "Whose?" He hesitated. "Earl Simmons." Lydia's body went cold. "Are you sure?" Murdoch nodded grimly. He was there that morning, probably the last man to see Henry alive. That afternoon, Earl Simmons was taken into custody at his home outside Bay Minette. Lydia watched from her car as deputies led him away in handcuffs, his face pale but defiant. Neighbors stood in their yards whispering. For the first time in decades, the truth was surfacing. Back at her desk, Lydia opened her draft and began typing. After 22 years, the Mobile River has finally returned what it was forced to keep: a name, a motive, and the face of betrayal. But as her fingers moved across the keys, she couldn't shake the hollow feeling inside. Justice was coming, yes, but it had taken half a lifetime. And the man who'd buried it all might still be out there, hidden behind a polished smile and a journalist's desk. The courthouse in downtown Mobile buzzed with tension as the trial of State versus Earl Simmons began. Reporters crowded the steps, microphones outstretched, cameras flashing in the humid Alabama air. After 22 years of silence, the truth behind Henry Lowell's disappearance was finally being spoken aloud. Lydia sat near the back of the courtroom, her notebook balanced on her knees, heart pounding as the past she'd chased for so long unfolded before her eyes. Earl looked smaller than she remembered, his frame slouched, his face drawn and grey. But when the prosecutor began his opening statement, Earl's jaw tightened. The stubbornness of a man who'd carried secrets too long etched deep into his features. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor said, his voice clear, "this case is about greed, betrayal, and the silence that cost a good man his life. Henry Lowell discovered that funds were being stolen from the Alabama shipyard pension account. When he confronted those responsible, he disappeared. The defendant, Earl Simmons, helped cover up that truth, and for 22 years, he let a widow believe her husband had drowned." Murmurs rippled through the room. Earl's defense attorney, a thin man in a navy suit, stood calmly. "What the prosecution calls proof," he said smoothly, "is nothing more than the coincidence of age-old rumors and the imagination of a journalist who sees ghosts in every shadow." His eyes flicked toward Lydia briefly. "This isn't justice, it's a story." Over the next several days, witnesses testified. Tommy Hensley confirmed the pension fund discrepancies. Sheriff Murdoch spoke about the missing evidence, his voice thick with remorse. Then, at last, Lydia was called to the stand. She adjusted the microphone, steadying her voice. "I started this investigation because Henry Lowell deserved the truth. I found his fishing log, notes about money missing from the shipyard. I found the ledger that proved Earl Simmons signed the withdrawals. And I found the evidence that tied him to the truck where Henry's blood was found. The defense attorney rose. Miss Kane, are you suggesting my client killed Mr. Lowell? I'm suggesting he knows exactly what happened that morning, Lydia said firmly. Earl watched her from the defense table, eyes dark and unreadable. For a moment she thought he might speak, but he looked away instead. When he finally took the stand, the courtroom went silent. The prosecutor asked, Mr. Simmons, did you meet with Henry Lowell on the morning of April 15th, 1995? Earl hesitated. Yeah, he said quietly. I did. What was the meeting about? He wanted me to go to the papers, said he was done being quiet. Said he'd tell the world about the money. And what happened then? Earl swallowed, his hands trembling. We argued. I told him to let it go. He wouldn't. He grabbed my arm, said he'd go to the sheriff himself. I shoved him. He fell. Hit his head on the side of the dock. His voice cracked. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. The courtroom gasped. Lydia felt her chest tighten. So you left him there? The prosecutor pressed. I panicked, Earl said, tears streaking his face. Hale told me he'd take care of it, that no one would believe me anyway. He said if I kept quiet, I'd keep my job. I was a fool. I should have spoken up. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours before finding Earl Simmons guilty of manslaughter and obstruction of justice. As the bailiff led him away, Earl looked toward Lydia. Tell Martha I'm sorry, he said softly. Outside the courthouse, rain began to fall, light and steady. Lydia stood under the awning beside Sheriff Murdoch. It's over, she said, though her voice carried no triumph. Murdoch shook his head. No, ma'am, the trial's over. The truth still got a few more miles to go. Lydia looked up at the grey Alabama sky and knew he was right. For Martha Lowell, for Henry, for the years that silence had stolen, this wasn't the end. It was only the reckoning that made peace possible. The weeks following the trial were quiet. The headlines faded, the courthouse emptied, and Mobile returned to its slow, southern rhythm. But for Lydia Kane, the silence carried weight, one that felt both peaceful and sorrowful, like the air after a summer storm. She had uncovered the truth, yes, but truth never came without cost. She visited Martha Lowell one last time at Magnolia Oaks. The old woman sat by the same window, the light softer now, her breathing weaker. Lydia placed a small clipping from the Mobile Register on the bedside table, the front-page story titled, Justice for Henry Lowell. Martha smiled faintly. He'd be proud of you, she said. You found what the river tried to hide. Lydia sat beside her, holding her hand. It was your strength that kept him alive all these years. I just followed where you pointed. The older woman's eyes glistened. I waited half my life to know what happened. Now that I do. She looked out toward the oaks swaying beyond the window. I can rest. They sat in silence, the kind that said more than words ever could. Martha passed away a week later in her sleep, clutching Henry's fishing cap. At the funeral, the small church filled with neighbors, reporters, and a few who'd worked beside Henry decades earlier. Sheriff Murdoch stood near the back, hat in his hands, his face somber but at peace. When the choir finished, Lydia spoke. Henry Lowell taught me that truth is patient. It waits for those willing to listen. Sometimes it takes years, sometimes lifetimes, but it never really disappears. It just drifts like the river until someone's brave enough to pull it to shore. After the service, Murdoch approached her quietly. You did right by him, he said. Lydia smiled faintly. So did you, Sheriff. You didn't give up, even when everyone else did. He nodded. We both know the river never forgets. It just takes the right tide to bring things back. Later that evening, Lydia drove to the same pier where Henry's truck had been found all those years ago. The boards were worn, the air smelled of rain and salt, and the water shimmered in the fading light. She sat at the edge, Henry's fishing log resting in her lap, the pages fluttering in the breeze. She whispered, You can rest now, Henry. She's with you again. A heron flew low over the water, its wings brushing the surface. The ripples spread outward, soft and endless. For the first time, the river no longer felt heavy with secrets. It felt like release. As the sun sank, Lydia thought about everything the journey had taken from her: sleep, safety, even trust. But it had also given her something unshakable, a purpose. Truth, she realized, wasn't about victory. It was about remembrance. Back in Mobile, the Register printed her final article in the series, titled "The River Remembers." It wasn't about corruption or guilt this time. It was about the people, the ones left behind, the ones who fought quietly for the truth and the ones who found peace only when the story was told. Her final words read, "In every town there's a river that keeps its secrets, but sometimes it gives them back, not to punish, but to remind us that memory is stronger than silence." Henry Lowell's name won't vanish again, because some stories once surfaced can never drown. As she turned off the newsroom lights that night, Lydia paused at her desk. On the corkboard hung a single photograph, Henry smiling by his boat, sunlight on the water behind him. She traced the edge of the photo with her fingertip and whispered, "Thank you for trusting me." Outside, the Mobile River glimmered beneath the moonlight, its surface calm, its depths finally at rest. Before the screen faded to black, her voice lingered softly. If stories like this move you, subscribe for more true accounts of ordinary people whose lives shaped extraordinary truths. And don't miss the next story waiting on your screen. The past still has more to tell.